Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. There is much to cover this week, and because of this, we're going to have to put episodes across 2 days. Today, Saturday, and another one tomorrow on Sunday. Today will be very much focused on foreign policy, specifically US-China relations, while also discussing the ongoing property crisis. And tomorrow will be a big episode on ideology as well as AI. First up, we move through developments in US-China relations. It's been a busy week on this front. We are now simply going to supplement what we have already covered from earlier in the week, because this is now the third episode on US-China relations this week. Let's begin with the positive or optimistic news in relation to guardrails and stabilization in the relationship before moving on to the more concerning areas. On Thursday, PRC Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin confirmed at a news conference that China and the US will have their first nuclear non-proliferation talks since July 2019. The Chinese delegation will be led by Sun Xiaobo, who leads the Foreign Ministry's Arms Control Department. The US will send Mallory Stewart, the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. The American office Stewart heads is responsible for providing oversight of the other country's arms control commitments. US-based The Wall Street Journal writes that the discussion doesn't signal the start of formal negotiations to set limits on each side's nuclear forces, as Washington has long done with Moscow. Instead, the session, to be held next week, specifically from Monday, quote, will provide American officials with an opportunity to probe their Chinese counterparts about Beijing's nuclear doctrine and the ambitious build-up of its nuclear arsenal. End quote. I can already hear the sounds of typing as several listeners try to correct my pronunciation of nuclear in the comments below. We note that China's nuclear arsenal is much smaller than the US's or Russia's, but it is believed to be undergoing rapid expansion. Quote, the Chinese leadership is still preparing for long-term competition with the United States. The hope is, if this exchange can be maintained and can happen regularly in the future, that might open up opportunities for more substantive conversations. End quote. Meanwhile, from today, Saturday, until next Tuesday, Washington's climate czar, John Kerry, is in California meeting with the PRC Special Envoy for Climate Change, Xie Zhenhua. According to the official US readout of the talks, the meetings, quote, builds on President Biden and President Xi's meeting in Bali last year, at which the leaders agreed to work together to address the climate crisis, and as part of ongoing efforts to maintain open lines of communication and responsibly manage the US-China relationship. End quote. At the people-to-people level, we have 3 notable developments from this week. First, a delegation from 11 groups, including the US Soybean Export Council, US Grains Council, and US Wheat Associations, is visiting China this week, days after the Chinese grain buyers signed an intention to buy billions of dollars worth of soybeans from the US, the first such signing since 2017. US Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, described agriculture as the ballast in the relationship. Second, a New York-based ballet theater troupe of 85 dancers has returned to China after almost a decade. The troupe will open at the Shanghai Grand Theater, where they will perform the so-called Classic Old and New, a program of 3 varied works encompassing contemporary as well as classical choreography, according to the group's artistic director. Third, China is hosting a delegation of so-called Flying Tigers veterans and their family members this week. The Flying Tigers is the nickname given to the first American volunteer group of the Republic of China Air Force, formed to help oppose the Japanese invasion of China, operating from 1941 to 1942. There was one more piece of pro-stabilization news. Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, has given another speech on China. This one is called On the Biden Administration's Economic Approach toward the Indo-Pacific. Quote, as I've said, the United States does not seek to decouple from China. A full separation of our economies or an approach in which countries, including those in the Indo-Pacific, are forced to take sides, would have significant global negative repercussions. We have no interest in such a divided world and its disastrous effects. And given the extent of economic linkages within the Indo-Pacific region and the complexity of global supply chains, it is also simply not practical. Instead, we are de-risking and diversifying by investing at home and strengthening linkages with allies and partners around the world. We've put forward a vision of the world grounded in values we share with these allies and partners, and in which there is also a healthy and stable economic relationship between the United States and China. End quote. She then says, to advance this vision, their economic approach with China will continue to center on three main goals. First, securing national security interests and advancing human rights. Second, seeking a healthy economic relationship that benefits both sides. Quote, this means responding appropriately to China's unfair economic practices, such as non-market policies that disadvantage American firms and workers, and barriers it imposes to market access, and its use of economic power to coerce vulnerable trading partners. End quote. And third, working to collaborate on global challenges from climate change to debt distress in low-income countries. Of course, these, as well as other developments which we've covered earlier this week, are all positive, small signs of stabilization in arguably the world's most important bilateral relationship. However, regular viewers know that the US-China relationship is still at its worst place in decades, with military tensions in the East and South China Seas at especially dangerously high levels. On Thursday, the US Navy confirmed that a 7th Fleet destroyer, as well as a Royal Canadian Navy frigate, quote, conducted a routine Taiwan Strait transit on November 1st, local time, through waters where high seas freedoms of navigation and overflight apply in accordance with international law. End quote. A spokesman for the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command responded the same day, expressing, quote, we organized warplanes and ships to shadow and monitor the passage in line with laws and regulations. End quote. While state-run Global Times has been known to engage in hyperbolic language from time to time, one piece it published this week perfectly captures, I would argue, the current mainstream elite view in Beijing towards the United States, reminding us, once again, that Beijing, fueled in part with a deep sense of grievance, is prepared for a long strategic competition with the United States. It is worth examining some of the language once again here. Quote, for the US, whether in the government or Congress, in diplomacy or domestic affairs, its obsession is pursuing a strategy of containment toward China, treating China as a systemic competitor. The US wants to engage in a new Cold War with China. While China refuses to define China-US relations in terms of a new Cold War, the US policy toward China reflects a great fear of China's development, and the constant hype of the China threat theory stems from a lack of confidence. In order to maintain its global hegemony, the US will inevitably comprehensively contain what it perceives as enemies. As China's strength continues to increase, the US containment of China will become more apparent. End quote. Next up, we discuss the Chinese property crisis. If you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing is a huge help for the channel. And for anyone who can go the extra mile and help keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. In yet another major red flag, China's outstanding property loans fell on a yearly basis for the first time ever on record. According to a statement from the People's Bank of China this week, the outstanding amount of loans to the property sector fell 100 billion yuan to 53.19 trillion yuan, $7.3 trillion US dollars, as at the end of September year on year. This is the first time the People's Bank of China has ever recorded a year-on-year drop, with public data going back to 2005. Outstanding mortgages declined 490 billion yuan to 38.42 trillion yuan during the same period, the second straight quarter of year-on-year contractions. Despite this, the central bank put on a brave face, saying that overall slowdown in property loans has stabilized. Reporting on this development, US-based Bloomberg writes, quote, China's ongoing housing crisis remains a serious drag on the economy, even though other sectors such as industrial production have recorded some improvement in recent months. The vast real estate sector contracted 2.7% in the third quarter, the biggest quarterly drop this year, according to official statistics. End quote. Hong Kong-based the South China Morning Post reports this week that as China's property sector, once representing a sizable chunk of the country's gross domestic product, becomes a less reliable growth driver, quote, Beijing has begun to seek out alternative guarantees for economic stability and dependable patterns of expansion. End quote. Indeed, as we have already seen, local governments have greatly increased infrastructure spending since 2021 to make up for the collapse in property sector investment. But we know all too well that this is not sustainable. So the question is, where else can it go? On Tuesday, Chang Haizhong, an executive director at Fitch Bohua, the Chinese subsidiary of Fitch Ratings, expressed, quote, We need to diversify industries instead of relying on one sector too much. However, it is impossible and unnecessary to find one single replacement for real estate. End quote. Zheng Xinli, former director of the Policy Research Office at the State Planning Commission, the former name of the National Development and Reform Commission, China's powerful economic planner, speaking to state-run Economic Observer last month and translated and quoted in the same South China Morning Post article, expresses, quote, China's economy took off in the 1990s through the revitalization of the old four pillars: electronic machinery, petrochemicals, automobile manufacturing, and construction. As industrialization has largely completed, there is a need to establish new pillar industries now. End quote. If property is overinvested, and so is infrastructure, what about manufacturing, especially manufacturing in new and advanced technologies? This has been a popular proposal thrown around this year. There are problems with manufacturing too, however. Quote, but manufacturing already accounts for an outsized 27% of China's GDP, compared to 14% for the rest of the world, and absorbs a huge amount of low-cost investment. What's more, its biggest constraint is weak demand, not scarce capital. Having local officials direct a huge increase in investment into manufacturing, even though private sector manufacturers have been reluctant to expand production, suggests that bad investment in property will simply be replaced by bad investment in manufacturing. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Saturday. And if all goes to plan, I will see you all for an extra episode tomorrow on Sunday.